Okay. Thank you guys for bearing with us while we work through some technical difficulties there, but we are all set up and ready to go. Today's live stream is going to be an AMA. A lot of you guys pre-submitted questions, so I'm going to start with those. We have a lot to get through, so that might take up the full amount of time. We will run a little bit late since we got started a little late. But still, please enter any questions that you might have in the comment section, because even if we aren't able to get to it this time, we'll try to get to it next time. You can also submit those questions to our email, info@sweetmarias.com, and we'll try to address anything we weren't able to get to today. All right. Really briefly, a little bit about me. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Ryan. I've been working with Sweet Maria's for almost 3 years now. My official title is merchandise manager, so I do a lot of stuff with merchandise, that kind of a thing. I also teach some classes, do demos, write some articles, and do some stuff for the wholesale side of our website, which is Coffee Shrub. So that's just a little bit of background about me. I'm going to go ahead and start taking these questions off one by one. Okay, so our first question comes from Henry, and he asks, when do Sweet Maria's get most of their shipments in, particularly from Ethiopia, Kenya, and Africa? He notices certain times of year have an abundance of super quality selections. So this definitely kind of depends on origin, because different parts of the world will have different kind of harvest cycles, and that's going to affect when we get our coffee in. For instance, we have a lot of coffees from Ethiopia that are landing right now, and kind of moving into July. But there's also coffee that's still at origin that hasn't shipped yet. A lot of our coffee from Kenya, to mention another African region, is set to arrive in July. But then Burundi and Rwanda tend to arrive a little bit later, more like August and September. There are some origins like Colombia that will do multiple harvests throughout the year. They have their big harvest and then a smaller harvest. So it really kind of depends. There are places that you can see some kind of helpful generalized breakdowns of seasonality and the harvest schedules for different regions. Counterculture has a really good one. If you go to their resource center, they have a map that walks you through coffee seasonality and shows you what's going on in different parts of the world depending on what month it is. There's also a map, kind of a table on the site of a place called Golden Waves, which I think is based in Jordan. It's some kind of import-export company, but they have a few different production timetables that, again, just kind of walk you through the general flow of those things. We do get a lot of emails about the arrival date list in our reviews. So if you look at our coffee reviews and go to the specs section, we do list the arrival date. And people get confused because there are two dates involved. So there's the date that the coffee actually arrives in the US, the kind of landing date, and then there's the date when we add it to the website. Important to remember, we have a lot of coffees to move through, and when we're buying a coffee and when a coffee kind of arrives stateside, we cup it, we assess its flavor, and how long of a shelf life we think this particular bean might have. And that's going to inform when we decide to release them. We can't post all of our coffees for sale as soon as they land, for a couple of reasons. Obviously, there's logistical issues with our warehouse. We have kind of a secondary, larger warehouse where we store a lot of our coffees throughout the year because all of the coffees we have don't fit in our warehouse. We only have the coffees that are live on the site in-house. So that's part of it. And part of it is also that if we posted all the coffees when they landed, then we'd have like a huge boom with like tons and tons of coffees at certain parts of the year. And then at other times of the year, you'd log on and there would be like a low selection, and that could go on for months and months. So by kind of cupping each coffee individually and judging it from there, we can ensure that everything that's on the site is fresh crop, but planned out accordingly. I do want to say that our green coffee team is constantly cupping and tasting not only new coffees, but also coffees that we currently have on our website, because we want to make sure that the descriptions and the scores are still accurate. If we notice that a coffee has started to take on age, or that it's changed, or that maybe we would cup it a little bit lower than we would have when we cupped it 6 months ago, we do adjust the reviews to reflect that. So we're not just kind of throwing stuff up there and it's a coffee that landed in, August of 2019, that's faded since then. If it's up there, even if it's from, 2019 or whatever, the review is current. It's based on how it's cupping at the moment that it's being sold. I hope that answers your question. Again, feel free to kind of hop back in with kind of more follow-up questions. We're always happy to help. Okay, so our next question comes from Jessica. So Jessica says that she has a really hard time getting a consistent tasty roast when roasting blends. She recently purchased our Espresso Monkey blend, and about half of the beans roasted very nicely, but the other half don't seem to expand or lose their chaff, but do get dark. She is roasting in a whirly pop on a gas stove. So for anyone who is kind of new to the community, a whirly pop is a stovetop roaster similar to the VKP Victorio that we have on the website now. About blends, roasting blends. First, if you already have an established blend, it's definitely easier to blend the coffee green and then roast it together. And in most cases, coffees can be roasted together. That's what we usually advise. We pretty much only say you should roast things separately and then blend them if you're not getting the results that you want when roasting them all together. There's also something called a melange blend that I'll get into a little bit later. Every coffee is going to roast a little bit differently, but there is a lot of averaging that kind of occurs between coffees in the roast chamber, especially when you're looking at a drum roast or an air roast system. It's also worth remembering that there are coffees that don't roast evenly, even when you're roasting them as single origins. Coffee from Yemen is a really good example of this. Ethiopian dry process coffees, or really any natural process coffees, don't tend to roast super evenly because of the processing method. That might be part of the thing that you, Jessica, are running into with Monkey Blend, because Monkey Blend always includes a little bit of a dry process coffee, usually Ethiopian. I think right now we're using a Rwandan dry process coffee in the Monkey Blend. That might be some of those beans that you say aren't expanding as much, aren't losing their chaff, because those coffees tend to be a little bit smaller in terms of varietal. You might not see as much expansion, and they also tend to have a little bit more chaff. Kind of a separate issue is that uneven roast color, that's not really a defect. Maybe if you're looking at like a wet processed Arabica, something from Central America, where you're expecting it to be like a little bit more uniform, you'll see a more even color, but even in that case, it's not necessarily going to be true, especially when you're at the lighter end of the roast spectrum. At the lighter end of the roast spectrum, you're always going to see kind of a varied mottled appearance. As you get darker, those things start to kind of even out. So back to what I was kind of talking about, a melange blend. So a melange blend is when each blend component is roasted separately and then blended. Side note, stovetop roasting in general, and there were a few questions about this, so we'll circle back to it. That's really the most difficult method to get a really even roast, especially at the lighter end of the roast spectrum, because of course there's just not as even of an appearance at the lighter end of the roast spectrum. The reason why it's so hard to get a really even roast in the stovetop is because since you're using a gas stove with a burner, you're not getting a super even application of heat throughout the roast. They're going to be coming in with a lot more contact with like the surface of the bottom of the roaster, which can cause some scorching, some of that kind of stuff. And you're also personally responsible for kind of agitating those beans and moving them around, which can be really tricky. There's just a little bit more room for kind of, you know, things not being super uniform. There are ways to kind of like work around this. I still think stovetop roasting is a really great method, especially if you want a cheap method to roast a lot of coffee really quickly. But if even roast is what you're after, stovetop roasting isn't usually the best choice. A lot of times I'll kind of push people more toward an air roaster or a drum roaster where it's a little bit more easy to get those really even results. Okay, I hope that answers your question, Jessica. If you want more help troubleshooting, send us an email and we will help you. Okay, so Nathan is roasting in a popcorn popper and really enjoying it. He has a hands-off cooling system, the colander on top of a fan, but what are some other cheap DIY ways to automate or streamline his process? So in terms of do it yourself, if you are using a popcorn popper, I'm assuming that you're referring to an electric air popper like the Nostalgia. Beyond external cooling, there's not going to be a ton of things that you can kind of build in that are going to automate things or make it a little bit more easy or streamlined, just because of the nature of the popper. Poppers, they have a small capacity, I'd say like 90 grams max for the Nostalgia, and they do tend to burn out pretty quickly, especially if you're using them really heavily. It's a $20 appliance that isn't really meant for that kind of heavy duty use, and it's not really built or designed for that. I would say that if you're looking to kind of streamline or get more capacity or get something that has a little bit more features, there's kinds of two ways that you can go. You could upgrade to something like the Fresh Roast, either the SR540 or the SR800. The Fresh Roast models are almost exactly the same as the popper in terms of the way that they roast, but they have a much higher capacity and they're going to give you a lot more control. You'll have control over heat settings, which you don't have in the popper, and you'll also have control over airflow, which can help you with profiling. It also is going to be built a little bit better. It's going to last longer. It comes with a warranty, so even though it has that higher upfront cost, long term it might end up saving you money rather than kind of burning through a popper and buying a new one. On the other side of the spectrum, if you want to kind of go more DIY and more manual, there's a lot of people who kind of build their own hot rod roasters, people who use heat guns, people who use barbecues, and those might be a really good option for you if you're not ready to kind of shell out a lot of money for an appliance. We do have a blog post in our library. I think it's called Hot Rod Roasters, so that's definitely something that I would check out if you're interested in kind of building something on your own. Beyond that, external cooling, having kind of that colander with a fan or a little box with a fan, that's an awesome way to immediately make your roast taste better just because you're preventing any coasting and really locking in the roast level that you want. So good job on that. Okay. So Bill wants to know, what is the best way to make a half-caf coffee? Are there any combinations to aim for? Should the beans be roasted separately and then combined, or can they be roasted together? So this is a great question. I would say in terms of combinations to aim for, I personally usually recommend choosing a regular coffee that is from the same region as the decaf beans that you'll be using, or the same varietal, has a similar flavor profile. that one might make it a little bit easier to pre-blend them and roast them together if you're really always doing half-caf, because they're going to roast pretty similarly. Decaf coffee, it definitely uh, roasts differently than regular coffee in terms of color change and the sound of the cracks. But usually I use a profile for a regular bean as kind of a starting off point for a decaf bean. So those are going to roast pretty similarly if they're from the same region. Even if they don't look the same in terms of what's internally happening, it's going to be pretty evened out. Again, this is also a really good way to learn about if you're roasting the regular and then roasting the decaf. It can really help you get much better and improve at your decaf roasting because you have these kind of benchmarks set by a regular coffee that's pretty similar. So I guess that would be an argument for roasting separately rather than blending. I think it also depends on what kind of experience you're going for in terms of the half-caf. If you want like a really light, bright, fruity coffee, maybe choose that as a regular, and then you can contrast it with like maybe like an earthier or more cocoa-centered decaf. Roast them separately and then mix them together. It's almost like an espresso blend where you're getting those top notes from the regular and the base notes from the decaf. Again, we use all Swiss water processed decaf. I think it does a really great job of preserving the flavor of the coffee. For instance, we have a roasted decaf currently available on the website that I was drinking yesterday, and it was a dry process Ethiopia, but I couldn't believe how kind of like fruity and bright it still was even through the decaffeination process. But that's probably a little bit more out of the norm for decaf coffee. You know, even with the greatest processing, it's going to have some effect on the flavor. So using kind of a regular coffee, roasting it separately and really looking for those flavors that are a little bit trickier to find in decaf can be a nice way of balancing out a half-caf blend. Okay. So here we have another question about getting an even light roast in a whirly pop. So again, just to really quickly run through what I just said a few minutes ago, it really depends on your definition of even. It's really difficult to get a super even roast using the stovetop method because, like I said, uneven heat distribution, lack of control, manual agitation, all of those kind of factors that make it really hard to kind of reproduce consistent roasts. Beyond that, how you can get a roast has a lot to do with roast level, varietal of origin of the beans you're using. Lighter roasts are always going to have a more mottled appearance and color and texture. So you're going to have a much easier time getting a more even roast, even at the lighter end of the spectrum with like a washed coffee from Central America, compared to like an heirloom varietal from Ethiopia, or a natural processed coffee where you have more varied bean size, more varied bean density, just kind of more differences that are going to make those beans roast a little bit differently. Again, I think the takeaway is just don't get too caught up on how even or uneven your roast appears. You want to rely primarily on taste when you're evaluating your roast. Sometimes the coffee doesn't look great, especially if you're dealing with something like a Sumatra, but it can taste really wonderful, especially if you're at the lighter end of the roast spectrum. Don't worry if it doesn't look exactly like, you know, the beans that you get from your local roaster. Focus more on how they taste. All right, this is an interesting question. This is from Tobias, and he says, in many countries, it's tradition to wash and rinse beans from the market before roasting. Why don't we wash in the West? Should we? We wash rice and regular beans before cooking, but not coffee. So I think the first thing to point out is that even though we talk about coffee beans, coffee isn't actually a bean. It's not a legume. It's a seed. So the nomenclature is a little odd, but it's a seed, not a bean, so we treat it more like a seed than a bean when you think about that kind of stuff. As far as where it's traditional to wash and rinse the coffees before roasting, I'm not sure if you're getting a little confused and referring to like, oh, the wet processing method, which is a processing method for getting down from the cherry to the bean. Um, if you do have more info, please reach out because I don't know exactly what you're referring to. Um, as far as why we don't rinse the coffee or wash the coffee, um, to take your example of like rice and beans, the main reason why, at least I'm not a chef, but the main reason why you rinse beans or rice is because it removes surface starch that can kind of make the rice or beans get like a little bit gummy. Gummy for the rice. For beans, I've heard that rinsing them can get rid of some like aluminum can flavor. Um, it basically improves texture and flavor. Um, with coffee, you want to be really careful about introducing green coffee to moisture because it can introduce mold and make it dangerous. And if you're worried about your beans being dirty, you know, we roast coffee at really high temperatures, so anything that might be on the surface of the coffee isn't going to survive the roasting process and the brewing process, which again is very hot. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Yeah. As we talk about with like organic coffee and that kind of stuff, you're way more likely to get pesticides or fertilizer or anything like that from fresh produce compared to coffee, just because we roast it. Interesting question, though. Okay, so it looks like we've got a three-part question here from Sangcho. So the first question is, would you please give us some secret recipe of coffee blending or basic rules? So we have an article that talks about exactly that, Sangcho. It's called Blending Basics. I just recently went back and revised it, so it is totally up to date. It walks through the different types of blends, how to kind of build a blend and think about a blend. It also is going to give you a few different kind of sample recipes for how a blend might be put together and why you're adding specific coffees for specific things and how that can kind of change it. That's a really good place to start, so I would check that out. His second part of his question is, do you prefer to roast single origin or your own blending? Wondering what we, the professionals, usually drink. Always weird to be referred to as a professional. I guess that's my imposter syndrome showing. Okay, so as far as single origin or blending, it's really personal preference. If you're asking me personally, I like variety, I like trying different things, and I like to be able to talk about the coffees that we have with all of you. So personally, I tend to gravitate more toward single origin, definitely for brewed coffee. For espresso, that can be a little bit different. Often blends are going to be designed specifically for espresso extraction. They might combine like the kind of like big body and chocolate notes of a Brazil with the bright top notes of like a Kenya or a Guatemala. Basically, you're kind of building something with a blend that's better than each component is individually. Maybe the Brazil would be kind of boring as a single origin espresso, but the Kenya is like way too kind of bright and acidic and in your face when it's being brewed as a single origin espresso. Mix those together and it's a really nice, balanced, full-bodied shot. So blending definitely does have a place, particularly I think in espresso. The other reason why people sometimes like blends compared to single origins is if you really like to have something that's a little bit more consistent, if you want to have your coffee taste the same way every day, blends are the way to go. The reason for that is because kind of coffee is an agricultural product. You're always going to kind of run out of a given coffee or a given blend component. But if you're using a blend, then you can just replace that one component with a new component as it comes in. And that way the overall character of the blend is staying the same, even as the individual coffees that make up that blend are being rotated in and out. So that's kind of the strategy we take with the blends that we sell through Sweet Maria's. You know, Monkey Blend that you buy now is going to be different than Monkey Blend from a year ago, but the experience of drinking it should be about the same. At least that's the goal. I think that's part of the reason why a lot of bigger companies will have these kind of flagship blends because people want to be able to go to the grocery store, look and see like, this is Counterculture Big Trouble, or this is Pete's Midger Dickinson blend, and know exactly what they're getting. Versus some people really love kind of experimenting and trying different single origins, but it's not for everybody. Okay, part 3 of Sang Joe's question. What advice would you give home roasters who want to open their own coffee bar or any coffee related business in the future? I would say my number one piece of advice is to, especially if you've never worked in coffee, if you're just like a coffee aficionado or like really into it as a hobby, a home brewer, a home roaster, if you want to go into business, use a consultant. There are a lot of like individuals and companies out there who specialize in helping people kind of open up their businesses, who really know the ins and outs of coffee and what it takes to be successful. You know, have a business plan, have a detailed budget. If you don't have experience working professionally in coffee, then bring in partners that do have that experience. You're definitely not the only person who has come to Sweet Maria's and said, hey, this is my hobby, I really love it, I'm ready to kind of transition into this being a business. But that's not really what we do at Sweet Maria's, and we're just not really equipped to give you that kind of advice. I don't want to just kind of throw information at you and have it not work. You know, we have limited information. And we're not a cafe, we're not a coffee shop. We do our production roasting, but our main role is as like, you know, an importer or seller of green coffee. So we're not going to know as much about the ins and outs of other parts of the business. More than anything, I would say, yeah, use a consultant, do your research. Know that margins in the coffee business as a whole are pretty slim. It can be really difficult to build a successful business. So kind of go into that with your eyes wide open. And good luck. Okay. Okay, this is another question about uniformity and color. So I'm gonna kind of try to touch base on this and go through this maybe a little bit more clearly than I did earlier. So Chuck wants to know, how uniform in color can we expect the beans to get using a popcorn popper? He can get anywhere from a Vienna roast to a super light city roast every time that he's roasting a batch. And at what point do you notice the biggest difference in quality and consistency of roast between the roasters as you move up from the popcorn popper? So how uniform in color you can get using an electric popcorn popper. It's definitely going to be easier to get an even roast in an electric popcorn popper compared to like a stovetop roaster. There will obviously be more variation in lighter roasts than in darker roasts, but the popper is usually pretty good at getting an even roast when you're working with an appropriate batch size. So that would be a batch size of like 70 grams to 90 grams. I know some people roast like 100 grams or 150 grams. It's really a little bit more coffee than the popper is built to handle, so that might be part of when you see a more uneven roast with your popper. I I do think if you're using that batch size and you're still getting a really uneven roast, it's possible that your popper is running too hot. So I would say that because there hasn't been enough moisture loss in the beginning of the stages of the roast, the beans aren't able to move and be agitated by the air that's being pumped out by the popper. So the beans at the bottom of the chamber might be roasting a little bit more quickly, while the beans at the top of the chamber aren't getting as much heat applied to them. So that might be part of why you're getting an uneven roast, or why your roast might be going really, really fast. Might be too hot. There are a few things you can do to kind of combat that. One thing that I like to do with my popper anytime that I roast using the popper is, for the first minute or two of the roast, I'll kind of hold it up and shake it using like dishcloths or something like that, because it can get a little bit hot. That just kind of helps the beans move around and be agitated while we're waiting for the moisture loss to kick in, and for the beans to get light enough that they can move really easily on their own just from the air being put out by the popper. Another thing that you can do to slow down your roast is to use an extension cord or a power strip. This is kind of our weird workaround because you can't really control the temperature in the popper, but that cuts the voltage that's going into the machine and can make it stay a little bit cooler and help you extend that roast a little bit more. If you are kind of thinking, okay, I've done the popper, I'm ready to move up, I think you can get a really quality roast from the popper. There's a reason why we've pushed them forever and why we really like them. If you're ready to kind of move on to the next thing, or if the evenness is really the thing that's kind of getting you down, your roast isn't quite even enough, a lot of times the first place that I'll send people after they've worked with the popper, especially if they really liked the popper, is the fresh roast, just because it works with the same principle as the poppers, but it's going to have increased capacity, better visibility, and way more control over the roast because you can control temperature and airflow. Yeah. But again, that's just a starting off point. We do have some really great articles kind of walking you through. I believe in the article about getting started home roasting, we walk through a lot of different types of machines and the pros and cons of each, because what roaster is going to be right for you really depends on what you're trying to get out of the roast. If you want to get a little bit of personalized advice about what might be the right step for you moving forward from the popper, please do send us an email. It's one of the easiest things for us. We can just ask you a few questions, hear what you're really trying to get for, and kind of recommend machines accordingly. All right. So Steve is asking our next question. So this is about the Bmore 1600. He says not the upgrade, so he might be talking about the Bmore 1600 or the Bmore 1600 Plus. The most recent version of the Bmore is the Bmore 1600 AB. That's the black unit, the all black unit, versus the black and silver unit, which is the 1600 or 1600 Plus. So usually his roasts are usually pretty consistent, but getting a uniform roast level or color still eludes me. Beans are typically Ethiopian, Central American, Sumatran, and prefer lighter roasts. Is there a consistent typical setting and technique for the Bmore to hone and process? So again, it's kind of becoming the theme of today. Uniformity of appearance is not going to be a measure of the quality of roast, especially with a lighter roast, especially if you're roasting Sumatra. We actually have a whole blog post about why Sumatran appearance is so strange and why it's not something to worry about. Or in Ethiopia, where again you're dealing with an heirloom varietal that might have a lot of mixed density and just lack of uniformity between the beans. So uniformity of appearance is not an issue. If your coffee isn't tasting the way that you like, then that's kind of a separate issue. There's no kind of typical settings or technique for the Be More, or really for any roaster where we're like, step 1, step 2, step 3, this is the exact way to do it. And if you do this with any coffee, it's going to turn out exactly right every time. Just because there's a lot of factors, things will be different for different coffees. Giving general advice is really, really tricky beyond what we include in kind of the tip sheets that we send along with the roasters. Coffee roasting is also so personalized. So much of it is about what you like, what you want, that if I give you what I do, my typical roast for the Be More, it could be totally different from the coffee that you're trying to achieve, and you might really hate the results. And the way that I roast is very different from like the way that Lana roasts or the way that Vivian roasts. Everyone kind of has their own thing, even if we're following the same general principles. So what I would say to anyone is look at the tip sheets, do some trial and error, kind of try stuff out. Don't be afraid to mess up a batch here or two. It's impossible to always get it perfect on the first try. And if you want specific advice, if you're having trouble with a specific bean, or your roaster is doing a specific thing and there's a specific kind of off flavor in your coffee that you're trying to deal with, those are the issues that we can kind of do a really good job of helping you troubleshoot and helping you kind of walk through, okay, here's one thing you can change about your roast procedure that might give you something closer to the results that you say that you're looking for. You know, we try to do the best we can. Okay. Oh, another coffee about blending for espresso. Another question about blending for espresso. Can you mix hard and soft coffees, and what are good coffees to blend for espresso? Definitely look at the blending basics. That's going to be really helpful for you. As far as soft and hard coffees go, this does come up somewhat often because the Be More manual kind of talks about this is how you should roast a soft bean and this is how you should roast a hard bean. For us, we haven't found that to be the most helpful or instructive way of categorizing coffee or thinking about coffee. I will say soft coffees, what's considered a soft coffee, tends to be lower grown, lower density. Oftentimes it's going to be from somewhere like Brazil, versus what's considered hard coffee is going to be denser. Usually it's a higher grown bean from a place like Kenya or Ethiopia. You can definitely blend them together. You can definitely roast them together. It just depends what you're looking for and what you're trying to get out of your espresso blend. If you do roast them together and it's just not turning out the way you want, you can always transition to a melange blend where you're roasting your soft beans and your hard beans separately and mixing them together. Okay. Omid wants to know why Robusta gets such a bad rap. He consistently uses very high quality Indian Robusta at 30% in espresso blends, and it adds flavor, complexity, and crema. I'm convinced the issue others experience is due to the use of low quality Robusta. So right off the bat, I definitely agree that there's a difference between high quality and low quality Robusta. We don't carry Robusta very often, but we will carry it from time to time, and we do include it as a blend component in liquid amber. So we're not those people who are like, all Robusta is bad. Definitely not. It has its place. So I agree with you there. And again, particularly for espresso blends, Robusta can be really good for increasing body. It gives you more crema. Robusta has a way higher caffeine content compared to Arabica, so that can be a fun thing to kind of pump you up, give you a little bit more energy. But I think it's worth noting that even in your blend that uses a really high quality Robusta for espresso, you're only using it as 30% of your blend, which actually sounds a little high to me. And drinking Robusta straight as like a brewed coffee is going to be a really different experience from drinking a shot of espresso with Robusta in a blend. Even the highest quality Robusta if you just do a blind cupping with a robusta next to, you know, an Arabica that's even not cupping super high. Let's say it's cupping like 82, 84, which is lower than pretty much all the coffees we have on Sweet Maria's. There's going to be no comparison in terms of which one is scoring higher or tasting better. It's always going to be the Arabica. I think beyond the kind of just that blanket, Robusta is not going to taste very good by itself for the most part. Maybe, and this is completely me just spitballing, you know, there's less incentive to pay really close attention to processing and farming Robustas compared to Arabicas because you're just not going to get as much money for it. So from a farmer perspective, it's kind of like, why am I putting in like all of this time and all of this effort and processing it really nicely and sorting it carefully when I'm still not going to get the price that I might get for a lower quality Arabica? It's just, there's not as much incentive to kind of really make Robusta like pristine and perfect. There are obviously exceptions. There are some really high quality Robustas out there, but it's still going to be a very different category from an Arabica. But good for espresso blends, depending on what you're going for. If you like liquid amber, Robusta is good. Okay. So Casey has a question about rest time. I know we're kind of butting up at the end of the time here since I went a little late. I'm going to go all the way to 2. I'm going to try to squeeze as many questions in as I can, and hopefully we'll have another AMA soon so that I can get to everything that I missed today. But to turn back to Casey's question, you're supposed to let the roasted coffee beans sit for 24 hours or more before you grind the beans. Is that correct? Why? Is it always 24 hours? Is it more? Is it less? What happens if you don't wait? And after you roast the beans while they're resting, should they be kept in an open container or sealed? And just overall storage of roasted beans. Okay, so about off-gassing. We recommend 12 to 24 hours minimum. If you want to know what it tastes like when you don't give it that wait time, try it. Try roasting and then brewing right away. It usually tastes pretty weird from the CO2. It often tastes really roasty, even if it's a lighter roast, and kind of mellows out with just like a few hours of rest. But try it. It's not like going to kill you. Some beans need more rest, some beans need less rest. A lot of times like a Brazil might benefit from like 72 hours of rest. A lot of times if we drink a coffee and we're like, oh, this needs some time to mellow out, we'll talk about that in our cupping notes and say like, hey, you should give this a little bit more rest time. Brew application affects how long you should kind of let things rest. Like pour over or brewed coffee, immersion, something like that. I think it peaks between like 2 to 5 days off of roast. That's just my personal preference. But espresso, I think, benefits from a little bit more rest, again, just because of the pressure of the extraction. So a lot of times if I'm brewing espresso, I want something that's rested for at least 7 days. That's just me. Different people will tell you different things. But definitely you're going to enjoy your coffee more if you let it rest a little bit. As far as storage goes, definitely don't store your roasted coffee in the open air because contact with the oxygen is going to make it go stale pretty quickly. If you're trying to degas, you obviously don't want it in a sealed tight container because that CO2 is going to have nowhere to go. You can use like a tin that has a valve in it. We carry a few different ones. If you look in our coffee storage section of our products, those allow the CO2 to escape. It's a one-way valve, so CO2 can go out, but oxygen can't go in. You can use a mason jar if you don't want to spend money on an additional kind of thing to have in your kitchen. Put your coffee beans in a mason jar, seal it, and just don't close the lid all the way. Let it degas for 24 hours, and then you can screw that jar all the way shut. That's going to work just as nicely. After those 24 hours, you do want to seal it up once off-gassing has kind of evened out or slowed down to a trickle. You're going to want to store it in an airtight container just to keep that oxygen away, keep it fresh as long as possible. Okay. So Fernando says, I recently started making a lot of espresso after getting a Sylvia. He roasts using a retro popcorn machine. Is there a different approach to use for roasting espresso versus pour over? No, I don't think there's really necessarily a different strategy. You might want to develop it a little bit more just to even out some of those kind of brighter aspects that can be really pleasant in a brewed coffee, but a little overwhelming as an espresso. As far as what coffees I look for or what qualities I look for, if I think something's going to be good for espresso, I'd say balance and body, just to kind of go through those things quickly. And again, like a little bit of a longer rest time. Okay. Ooh, okay. So I think I've got time for about 2 more questions. There are other questions that I haven't gotten to, but again, we'll get there. So Howard wants to know which is better, roasting with an electric or a gas roaster. So this is really going to depend on type of roaster. I'd say with an air roaster, it's not going to make a ton of difference if it's an electric or a gas-powered roaster. Usually these are smaller capacity roasters. I don't even know of any gas-powered air roasters, but again, those don't tend to be larger capacity machines. The main issue with most electric drum roasters is that they use an electrical heating element. So the heating element is not super responsive to changes in temperature, because once it heats up, it takes a really long time to cool down. That can make profiling a little bit trickier or kind of force you to rely on things like airflow to profile and adjust things, because you can't really count on a really quick adjustment in temperature. But that's not a universal thing. It's going to be a bigger problem, obviously, with larger batches. There are electric roasters like the Quest that we carry on Coffee Shrub, our wholesale website, that get really hot and do a really good job, even though they're all electric. Or you have something like the Bullet, which is electric but uses induction heating. If you don't know the difference between induction heating, kind of look into it. But basically, it's going to be just as responsive as a gas roaster. If you're doing large-scale production roasting, it's probably going to be cheaper and easier to get a large capacity gas-powered roaster, but as a home roaster, you can get great results with electric roasters as well. Okay. Oh man. This is an interesting question from Joel. So, can you discuss the impact of roast time on body development and how to use it as a lever in accentuating different flavor profiles in beans? For example, an 8-minute roast versus a 20-minute roast. So, I would say impact of roast time on body development. Body is going to be really affected by the length of the Maillard reaction, which is the browning reaction that occurs in all cooked foods, but particularly in coffee once you're kind of getting into the drying stage and continues throughout the roast. So during the Maillard reaction, it is creating a compound called melanoidins. So those are polymers that have a really high molecular weight. And there's a lot of research that links those melanoidins with texture, viscosity, and kind of the sensation and mouthfeel that you have when you're drinking something, kind of thickness. So more melanoidins, longer Maillard reaction, higher molecular weight, it's going to have a thicker mouthfeel, a bigger body. I don't want to get into specific roast times because there's so many factors that get into that. check out the Stretching Out the Roast articles in our library for a little bit more information. I would say you don't want to just roast longer to get bigger body, because you'll be roasting darker, and at a certain point that's going to yield less body because some of the solubles in the coffee are kind of burning away. So instead, I would kind of think about stretching out your drying stage, maybe first crack, to kind of accentuate that body and see how big of a difference that makes. Take a lot of notes, compare different roasts, and see if you can really see the difference in the mouthfeel. Okay. It is after 2. I have more questions to answer, but I just don't have time right now. I'm sorry about that, guys. And I can see there's a bunch more really great questions in the comment section. Byron and Byron runs all of our social media, so he's the one who's the technical wizard of this. Hopefully we'll be able to organize another AMA soon, maybe as soon as next week, and we can kind of start off answering those questions. If you do want a quicker answer, send us an email, info@sweetmarias.com. We will get back to you. Yeah, that's everything for me. Have a good rest of your day, everybody, and happy roasting.